A major victory at the Illinois Capitol this week, where the General Assembly approved civil unions legislation. That's next on Capitol View. Hello and welcome to Capitol View. I'm Amanda Vinicky, your fill-in host this week, and here to join me I have a lot of veteran journalists and Capitol observers, beginning with Mike Lawrence. Mike is the retired director at the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute, former press secretary for Governor Jim Edgar, and a syndicated columnist. So a lot of experience there. Charlie Wheeler, head of the University of Illinois Springfield Public Affairs Reporting Program. And we also have Scott Reeder, the managing editor of Illinois Statehouse News. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Thank you. Good to be here.
All right, so let's begin with this civil unions legislation that narrowly passed both the House and the Senate this week. It was a lot of emotion on the floor as we were all, I'm sure, watching and listening. A lot of cheers when it passed. Why don't we just begin? What is a civil union and how will this work when, as it is expected to, become law?
Well, first of all, let's talk about what it isn't. It's not marriage. But it does establish many of the same rights that marriage would provide to spouses.
Give me an example, or two.
Okay, well, one of the benefits would be that if somebody involved in a civil union had a situation where a partner was in the hospital, let's say in an intensive care unit, that person would find it much easier to get access to be at the bedside of that partner in a situation like that. It also applies to estate matters, probate matters. And we've had a situation in Illinois where people involved in a same-sex relationship could attain some of those rights, but they had to pay quite a bit in legal fees, and they had to have the papers with them in case of an emergency.
And there was testimony about, in fact, situations where same-sex couples had missed the passing of their partner because they didn't have that proper paperwork, for instance. So if all of that is afforded now to same-sex couples, and I should also point out that also heterosexual couples could enter civil unions if they so choose. How is it different then than marriage?
Well, I suppose the reason that it's different is it doesn't carry the name marriage. There was a lot of discussion about how in some fashion, legally recognizing these civil unions would detract from the holiness of marriage or the marriage as a sacrament, the sacredness of marriage. And at the risk of sounding cynical, it seems to me that heterosexual people are doing a pretty good job of knocking down the institution themselves with the divorce rate, the numerous stories, particularly of celebrities with their extramarital affairs and all of that. So I think the fact that a committed same-sex couple wants to have some of the legal rights and responsibilities that heterosexuals have through the institution of marriage, I don't think that really detracts from marriage at all. But it does not carry the name of marriage. As a matter of fact, Illinois law says that marriage can only be between a man and a woman. It doesn't affect the posture of a religious organization that does not have to recognize these civil unions and can still carry out its mission and bless unions of people of different genders if that is part of their faith belief. But as Mike said, it provides a lot of the same legal rights and responsibilities and benefits to same-sex couples that heterosexual couples who are married now enjoy. So in my mind, it's a matter of fairness and equality.
Scott?
But it's not marriage in the sense that it doesn't have portability in the sense that, like, if a couple a same-sex couple from Illinois moves to North Dakota, their relationship isn't recognized by that state. When they file with the IRS, the federal government does not recognize the relationship in the tax filings. They can't file jointly. In fact, I think it'd be interesting to see, now that civil unions are legal in Illinois, how
Almost, not yet.
what will happen?
On the way.
How
Governor
will,
Quinn still has to sign it. Yeah.
well, how will the Illinois National Guard handle if somebody gets into a civil union? I mean, will they be discharged? I mean, state law says this is illegal, but military law says this is.
Don't ask, don't tell, still in effect.
Yes, I mean, it could be very interesting. Now,
of course, that could be a moot point because the civil union legislation, once Quinn signs it, as is expected to, won't become effective until June 1st, and by then the United States military may have done away with the...
Very possible. But I think that a lot of the federal, there's no federal benefits to civil unions, and portability between the states is an issue as well.
Right, as a married man, you can move wherever and your marriage is recognized, but civil unions only in the 5 other states where civil unions in the District of Columbia, where civil unions or something like it is in place, would an Illinois couple's civil union be recognized.
In fact, I was just talking to somebody who has gotten into a civil union in Vermont several years ago, and she was saying that her and her partner now live in Florida, where they don't have civil unions, and she said, now, if we ever wanted to get divorced, one of us would have to move back to Vermont and live there for a year to have standing to get divorced because Florida courts don't recognize our relationship, so they would have to do that. I think there's some interesting issues that are coming up as time goes on and they become more common in more states.
Right. At first, it seems simple. You go to a county clerk, get a license as you would a marriage, and again, of course, a marriage needs that license. It's just not the church ceremony that so many people have that is there. So, and also I should point out that you brought up divorce. If somebody wanted to dissolve a civil union, it basically involves a similar legal procedure. But as you said, raises a lot of interesting questions, including what about the thought? Governor Pat Quinn said one of the reasons that he supports it, not the main one, I don't believe, but is that he says it could help the state's economy. What do you think about that? Do we see this being a tourism boom for Illinois, or a demonstration that Illinois is a tolerant state and will attract businesses?
Well, I think it's pretty hard to demonstrate, at least at this point, whether it'll help the economy. And you might hear people on the other side of this issue saying it would hurt the economy.
Saying we're out of here.
I just think it's basically a non-issue and a non-factor. I mean, a vote or support for this or opposition ought to be based on other factors than the economy.
What about the critics who say Illinois can't afford this and businesses, they also may have to pay some extra because if people enter civil unions, then their partners would get health benefits, insurance benefits?
I think the impact will be negligible in that regard, and many of the major companies and even smaller ones in Illinois already provide those kind of benefits.
Domestic partners and such.
Yeah.
Well, it was interesting because in the news conference after the legislation passed the Senate, that very question was put to the Senate sponsor, Senator Kaler from Peoria, and his response was, well, companies face that every day with heterosexual people who get married. Now suddenly you have a spouse on the health insurance, a spouse that's entitled to benefits. And businesses don't scratch their head and say, well, this person is an attractive young woman, we're not going to hire her because she might get married. We're going to hire this 70-year-old guy who's, past his prime because we don't have to worry about there being a spouse, or if there's a spouse, we don't have to worry about her getting pregnant or anything. So Kaler's argument, I guess, or his point, and I think it's well taken, is that that's just a negligible thing. It's not going to have any big impact one way or another on a business decision.
So why now? What changed in Illinois that, as I had mentioned, this is something that activists have been trying to get through for years. What has happened that Illinois this week was able to, that legislators got it through?
Well, if you look at human rights issues, civil rights issues, they evolve incrementally. And I think that's the case here. The first gay rights issues were introduced decades and decades ago. And I also think changing public opinion is a factor. The Chicago Tribune poll recently showed that I think it was 57% of the people in Illinois approve of civil unions, 32% oppose. But what I found interesting is that if you back out the people 65 and older, then it's about 60 to 30. And if you look at between 18 and 35, it's 3-to-1 in favor of civil unions. I've spent several years on a university campus, and it's really a non-issue among young people. And when I say a non-issue, they don't have any problem with civil unions, and frankly, most of them have no problem with same-sex marriage. It is generational in a lot of ways.
Speaking of same-sex marriage, there are critics that say this is basically same-sex marriage. It's just a difference in name. I know we've already acknowledged some of those differences, but they say now that Illinois has this, it will lead down a path to gay marriage. Either equal protection lawsuit and a court will all of a sudden say that Illinois needs to offer gay marriage. The sponsors of the legislation, Representative Greg Harris and Senator Kaler, had said, it took a lot to get this. They're going to leave it here for now. But any thoughts on gay marriage in Illinois and how near, far away that is?
Well, as far as the equal protection lawsuit goes, I guess you could make the very same argument if they didn't have civil unions at all. You could make an equal protection lawsuit saying that they're being denied equal rights based on that. In fact, if memory serves, Iowa didn't have civil unions when the Iowa Supreme Court ruled that there was a state constitutional obligation to provide marriage to same-sex couples as well as to heterosexual couples. So, to me, that argument falls short. In fact, on a state level, really the only issue here is one of name. It's a political issue. As people have a hang-up, maybe rightly, maybe wrongly, but marriage is a religious institution, and some people have a problem with the state attaching the word marriage to it. So, in a way, it was a bit of a political compromise to go with the civil unions.
Right, because there are those who say that gay marriage is it, and then there are those who say nothing.
And here's a thought that's not original with me. I've seen it elsewhere. Maybe the state should get out of the business of marriage altogether, be it for same-sex, be it for opposite-sex couples, and say, yes, marriage is a sacrament, as many denominations believe. It's a blessing from God. It's something holy. We in civil society, civil law, have no business engaged in that. We will accept people who've been married in a church, and we'll give them civil union status, whether they're same-sex, opposite-sex, but we're not in the marriage business. That's a religious institution. We agree with those folks, and so let's take marriage out of the civil law altogether.
Well, whether or not that happens, I'm convinced we will have same-sex marriage legalized in Illinois. It's a matter of time. As I said earlier, I think it's incremental, and this is one more step, but I'm very confident that we're going to have same-sex marriage.
Given the changing public opinion polls that you've cited, do you think that there are going to be any legislators who face retribution for this at all? I know that it was bipartisan in the sense that there were basically a handful of Republicans who supported it, but one senator, incoming Treasurer Dan Rutherford, Any thoughts on that, or even Governor Pat Quinn, who spent a lot of time lobbying legislators and had come out in favor of civil unions, getting flack from the Catholic Church? I know the head of the Springfield Archdiocese, Bishop Thomas Paprocki, had issued a statement calling to question basically Quinn's faith as a Catholic, saying that civil unions are contrary to natural mortal law, I believe. Any thoughts on kind of the politics on the back end?
Well, I think that part of it is that as far as retribution goes, I mean, there was a reason why it was voted on in a lame duck session. After the election, before the inauguration, it managed to bring in some legislators who were leaving the legislature from more conservative districts who personally favored civil unions to vote for it. Right? I think if this had been done before the election, they would not have been able to pass this, especially when you look at how close the vote was in the House. So I think that that had a lot to do with it. I would be very surprised if there's much retribution on this overall.
I think we ought to point out the two Republicans who won statewide office in Illinois in November have both been longtime supporters of gay rights, and one of them, the treasurer-elect, Senator Dan Rutherford, was the only Republican in the Senate who voted for the civil unions. And I don't know of any legislator who has ever been defeated on a gay rights vote. It's been used against some, but unsuccessfully. There are some districts, legislative districts in the state, where I could see a vote in favor of civil unions perhaps being politically suicidal. I'm thinking about the part of the state that I used to live in until recently, Southern Illinois. But I think if you look at it from a statewide perspective, in most districts in Illinois, it's not a politically radioactive vote.
In fact, the opposite in some districts. Yeah. A lot of talk about, for instance, Senator James Meeks, a Democrat who's trying to be mayor of Chicago, and a lot of talk that perhaps he won't fare very well in that race because the very active voting bloc, the gay and lesbian community in Chicago, won't like his no vote. Let's move on to some of the other work that the General Assembly got to this week. Obviously, civil unions did get the most attention, but for pensions, it's part of Illinois' burgeoning budget problem, and a lot of cities have said that they're having problems paying their pensions for firefighters and police. Charlie, why don't you tell us briefly what legislation that has gone through the House and the Senate does to future those who are beginning January 1 of 2011 firefighters and police, and why this legislation is now on its way to Governor Quinn.
The legislation kind of parallels the legislation that the General Assembly passed and was approved earlier that affected every public employee in the state except for police officers and firefighters. It already covered county workers, city workers, but not those two categories. And its provisions are similar in that it requires people to work longer when they retire. Their pensions are calculated in a way that will give them less benefits. For example, instead of being calculated on what their paycheck was on the last day that they worked, it'll be based on the best 8 years out of the average of the best 8 years out of a 10-year period. I believe they're going to have to work until age 55 instead of 50. And there are other changes like that. The whole idea is to reduce the out-year costs. Now, there's the same arguments were being made that were made with respect to the state systems, in that we should make changes that are going to impact people who are now working because they're earning these benefits at what we think are exaggerated levels. But I believe that the Constitution doesn't allow you to do that, and a lot of other people feel that way too. But certainly you can change the conditions under which someone will be employed in the future, which is what this legislation would do. And the difficulty, I think the difficulty, well, there's a couple things. One, city governments have faced the same kind of pressures that the state government has. Do we put aside money for future retirees' benefits, or do we spend the money now for needed services that our folks want right now? And a lot of cities just kind of put it off. Cities also for a long time had the problem that the benefit levels were set by the General Assembly.
Not by themselves.
Not by the city council and the mayor. So the General Assembly could give some sweetheart deal to policemen or to firemen or to other city employees for that matter, local government employees. And then the bill for it gets handed to the mayor and the council, which obviously has people up in arms.
In this legislation, I should point out, concessions, as you explained, from the labor unions representing firefighters and police, but cities will have to contribute to the pension funds. That's part of the deal, because
part of the deal
unions were saying, this isn't
I
fair,
believe
it's not all our fault.
There's a provision that if the city doesn't put in what it's supposed to, the state will take those dollars out of money that the city would otherwise get in sales tax and the city's share of income tax and put those into the retirement system for the city.
A lot of those cities have done a better job than the state of funding those pension programs.
Which isn't tough, right?
Yeah.
Oh no, it's a mixed bag across the landscape of the state. I mean, some are fully funded, others are funded like it's zero.
Looking to another revenue measure, let's talk about gambling. The Senate did pass, so again, not the House. It's unknown where this will go. I wouldn't place any bets yet on gambling and allowing 4 new riverboats. So one in, let's see, Lake County, Suburban Cook, Danville, and Rockford, and then the city of Chicago would get its own casino as well as slots at horse race tracks. Scott, what are your thoughts? Is this going to go anywhere? Would you cash in your chips?
I think George Ryan used to say you're a fool if you ever try to predict what the General Assembly will do. But I would be very surprised if it goes anywhere. Gambling bills, we call them Christmas tree legislation for a reason. So much stuff gets put on them that they finally collapse. I mean, you kind of think about that. I mean, that's a pretty massive increase in the level of gambling in the state. I mean, taking those 6 land-based racetracks and adding slot machines is basically creating 6 land-based casinos, and then adding on 4 floating casinos on top of that. That's an awful lot of gambling. The people who have current gaming licenses are very much opposed to it, and they're major contributors. I just would be plus, the whole moral issue. There's a lot of social opposition to gambling in our society, and I just would be very surprised if it goes anywhere.
And also looking to casinos, that would bring in what I believe the estimate was $1 billion a year through this major gaming bill. Then there was also a thought that Illinois could bring in more money if Illinois rescinded part of its statewide smoking ban for indoor workplaces and allowed smoking at existing casinos in separate kind of smoking rooms or smoking areas. That did not go anywhere. One of the pieces of legislation that we saw kind of wait. The legislature will be back in January, so who knows. What do you think about that? Is that going to happen?
I would think that it probably won't. The argument that's made is that because of the smoking ban, Illinois' casinos have taken a big hit in terms of the dollars that they bring in, therefore the state has taken a big hit. There's, what would you say, statistical evidence that suggests this could be true. The people who want to keep the smoking ban say, well, the economy's bad. Yeah, people don't have money to go and spend it at the boats. The people who want smoking in the casinos say, well, yeah, the economy's bad, but the boats in Iowa and the boats in Missouri didn't see the drop-off that we did, and they allow smoking. Then the response to that is, yeah, but the casinos in Missouri, in St. Louis, they have that new, what's it called, Luminaire place. That's really a glitzy, gorgeous place. It's not some dumpy boat. And the boat in Rock Island, which is an area you know very well. That's been really upgraded, and I think their revenues aren't down similarly to other votes in Illinois.
Yeah.
You know, I'm going to cut in just because we've got just a short bit of time left, and I wanted to hit on, speaking of the budget, Governor Pat Quinn was briefly asked about that, and because one of the complaints during the civil unions legislation was, why are we spending all week focused on civil unions when Illinois has this $15 billion deficit with this massive backlog of bills? And Quinn didn't really say much. He said, I anticipate major action on a lot of bills before the next General Assembly, and there's more work to be done, and he has faith that Republicans and Democrats will work together. Briefly, thoughts on that? Should more have been done this week?
Well, it occurs to me that the people who are doing the complaining, as we were talking before the show started, maybe they were people who wanted to vote no and couldn't think of any other reason to rationalize it. I didn't see any of those people standing up and saying, here's my plan to solve the problem. Here's the tax increase I want to be for. Here's the borrowing package. Here's the spending cuts I want put in place. Why don't we vote on those? And I've watched this stuff for a really, really long time, for better or for worse. And the state's finances are a cyclical thing. We're at a really low point now. We'll recover from it. We'll be okay for a while. The next time there's a recession, we'll go down the tubes again. The vote on civil unions it's a landmark vote. There's a bridge been crossed. We will not come back to that issue. It's not going to be repealed in the future. And so this is, as Quinn suggested, this is like a vote for the ages, whereas the budget crisis is going to be with us again and again. It'll be recurring, for all of the state's history.
Either of you quickly?
Well, just quickly, we do have a horrific budget situation, the worst I've seen. But I found it very difficult to take seriously the argument from some of these folks that we ought to be addressing the budget when they haven't been willing to address the budget for several years.
Well, that's about all that we'll have time for, much like the General Assembly, which did not also get to, let me see, medical marijuana was voted down by the House. A brief recap here. Also, no votes taken on death penalty legislation and saying that Illinois would no longer a permanent moratorium on death penalty. So that's what the General Assembly didn't get to. I do want to end actually on a sad note and condolences to the friends and family of Republican Representative Rich Myers, who passed away after a bout with cancer this week. So condolences to him. Thank you very much for joining me. I'm Amanda Vinicky, and we'll see you next week. Thanks so much to you, Scott, and Charlie, and Mike.
Thank you.